We've got 80-point Wulfen, 90-point Thunderwolves, and a whole slew of character decreases. Let's talk about the Space Wolves and the boost that 40k's big new update has brought them. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where in this video we're talking Space Wolves, talking through their place in Warhammer 40k, focusing on 5 units that dropped really quite nicely with the recent points cuts, and stopping off along the way to talk about some snazzy Space Wolf aesthetic upgrades that you could use to add a little bit more runic Viking goodness to a Space Wolves army. Previously in 40k, Space Wolves were not doing so great in terms of competitive gaming. At grand tournaments they had a win rate hovering around the 42% mark, a little bit below standard Space Marines using the Gladius, and just in general definitely towards the lower end of the 40k power spectrum. They're not quite one of the armies that was really struggling the most compared with a few. I feel like as the Divergent chapters go, Space Wolves have maybe been saddled with one of the more underwhelming unique detachments. The rules for sagas with the characters accomplishing great deeds to deliver army-wide buffs is very fluffy and thematic, but also just very unreliable in that some army lists might be kind of hard to achieve those quests in the first place, and they often tend to be at least somewhat in your opponent's control as well, whether or not you can do them. For that reason, Space Wolves lists tended to be running Gladius a fair bit more than the Champions of Rus, at least competitively. Easy access to advance and charge for 1 CP is absolutely excellent in a melee army, never mind the other cool buffs. You just tend to get a bit more reliable value, even if you don't have quite the same level of flavour. Still though, there were definitely some interesting Space Wolf datasheets. I feel like a bunch of them were maybe a little bit overpointed when the index first dropped, but still things like Thunderwolves breaking through at 100 points for 3 of them were rather good, and Bjorn the Fell-Handed seemed to be another very common sight in Space Wolf lists. Just fairly good value overall, and he does seem to have got better. In general for the Balance Dataslate, there were some solid points cuts. Most of their units went down, including quite a lot of the important ones, though not every single unit took drops. In general they tended to be in the region of around about 10% points decreases, some a bit more, some a bit less. Maybe the characters taking slightly bigger decreases percentage-wise than most, not the worst news for the Space Wolves who tend to rely on them, particularly if they're using the sagas. They'll also profit and lose from any of the Space Marine points changes that happened as well. A bunch of good stuff for the Primaris went down. Things like the Redemptor Dreadnought flavours will be quite useful for the Space Wolves, I think. Plus I think it's quite helpful to have some more assault flavoured units like Aggressors and Blade Guard looking a bit better. And Eliminators seem to be quite a big winner out of the Space Marine points changes, dropping down to 75. Some things got some nerfs, Gladiator Lancers went up and Desolation Squads got very hit, but overall broadly a win. Of course though, there weren't any big rules changes for the Space Wolves. I think some kind of boost to the Champions of Rust detachment might have been quite nice. But otherwise, going forward, it probably is going to mean that the most optimal list would probably use Gladius. I think for the most part, the Champions detachment just doesn't really seem to deliver the same sort of success for the Space Wolves, though obviously you get lots of style points for using it, as it does just feel a lot more like playing Space Wolves as opposed to playing Ultramarines with a few unique units. In any case, for the main section of this video, we'll talk through 5 key units that dropped in points and why they're looking good right now. Just quickly prior to that though, I thought I'd just mention this video's sponsor, which I think might just be worth knowing that these guys are out there for Space Wolf collectors. They do make some fairly cool aesthetic upgrades for them. These guys are called the Primal Hounds, made by Grey Tide Studio, and they're basically aesthetic upgrades for Space Wolves, things like runic axes, sculpted shields, backpacks and shoulder pads and things, just adding a whole load of Space Wolves flavour to miniatures, maybe something that Games Workshop hasn't done enormously well, at least from a Primaris perspective yet. I guess they'll be waiting when their big range update happens. These bits are all offered basically as 2 different offerings, either 3D printed STL files, things that you can basically get the pack for and then print off as many as you want if you happen to own a 3D printer, or also as a physical product offering, where they ship out a good mix of the various different flavoured bits to add them as you'd see fit throughout a Space Wolf army. Included is most of the things that you don't normally expect for an offering like this, a whole load of custom heads and things, some of them bareheaded, some of them helmeted. I do quite like the winged one with the rune in the centre. A good selection of shoulder pads and a few different styles there. Again, plenty of talismans, animal skins, runes and upgrades. There's a few fairly ornate backpacks. I quite like the wolf's headed one on the right, which kind of reminds me of the wolf head style backpacks that Games Workshop I think had coming on one of their upgrade sprues at one point. The one with the axe and shield slung across the back is quite fun as well. There really is quite a bit of stuff, things for sky claws, character style capes. I guess they could be good for wolf guards. A bunch of shields which might work well for Blade Guard veterans maybe. I have seen a fair few convert them with various other style shields with the different chapters in mind. And perhaps particularly impressive are all these adornments that fit with a Redemptor Dreadnought chassis. again just allowing it to be decked out a bit easier in the same sort of style as a Wulfen Venerable Dreadnought. This is the breakdown of the main set that you can get from the physical bits if you prefer that to the STL type files. And basically, if you were looking to pick some of these up, then it's being run as a Kickstarter style campaign on a website called My Mini Factory, which I'll link down in the video description. Seems fairly popular with a bunch of their pledges met, and well over 1,000 people signed up at this point. And the price is either $39 for full access to the files, or it looks like the physical bits pack comes at $25 plus shipping, but that might vary a little bit in different areas of the world. I'll also leave that linked in the video description. In any case, check it out if you're interested. Always cool to see some independent creators making chapter style bits that just so happen to be compatible with Games Workshop's minis. In any case though, getting back to Space Wolf unit updates, first up I feel like Games Workshop might actually be dangerously close to actually making Wulfen good. In 8th and 9th edition they were basically just melee blenders that just absolutely destroyed virtually anything you threw them at, so it was a bit of a come down from 10th edition to have literally all of their profiles go to Strength 5 AP 1 Damage 1, kind of underwhelming against really quite a lot of enemy targets, even if they were significantly cheaper. After the update, they're down to 80 points, down from 100 per 5 models, a great big 20% points cut there, so that's pretty significant, though admittedly they weren't really being played competitively all that much before that. They have a big weakness being objective control 0, which I do think really limits them. Still though, going down to just effectively 16 points per model is very significant for the profile that they have. They seem to be good both from a damage and defense point of view now, and I feel like both ways to field them are fairly reasonable. Even just looking at the worst case scenario for both, 2 wounds at toughness 5, a 4+ save and a 6+ feel no pain really isn't too bad at 16 points. They're certainly a lot more resilient to small arms than many. On the offensive, with the worst loadout, they get the 4 attacks at strength 5, AP 1 and damage 1, which I'd say is probably kind of okay but not standout, but they do get to fight in death. And then of course depending on which you go for, either claws and melee weapons, instead you get 6 attacks at that profile, which goes from kind of okay to genuinely very scary. Or if you want them to be more defensive, then instead you can give them the 4+ invulnerable save with the Storm Shield. I feel that for 80 points you're getting either standout good melee with 30 attacks at that profile, or fairly standout good defense. Adding a 4+ invulnerable save into the mix really does make them very tough. Then beyond that they even move pretty quickly at 8 inches. In Gladius, if you can access advance and charge for them, then that's quite nice with the Stormfrag launchers. It does mean that they have a great threat range and can fire them before they charge in. The Stormfrags aren't generally going to change the world, but they're definitely not nothing against hordes. On average, if you have 5 of them firing the Stormfrag launchers before they go charging in, then you average around about 4 wounds to a 10-man guard or termagant squad. All the extra shots from blast definitely add up. Between all that, I feel like Wulfen actually genuinely seem like a fairly good unit now. They sort of feel like a nice sort of outrider screening type unit, move them forward quickly and have them be the ones that are taking and giving the first blows to the enemy. They could very comfortably bully a whole load of medium threat enemy objective holders, though I say you probably don't want too many of them given that they're OC 0, it just means that you're not going to be holding as many points, probably just a couple of squads listed in a battle line with other units to hold the points and be your main damage threat. Let me know what you think though. Would you be tempted to put some Wulfen squads in the army to bully enemy infantry? Next up, another really nice points cut that was pretty meaty went to Bjorn the Fell-Handed. He fell all the way from 220 points to 180 points, a big cut of 18%, so almost as much as the Wulfen. Admittedly, in the balance update though, he did get a slight side grade. His Ancient Tactician rule is one of those ones that counters enemy stratagems and increases them by +1 CP. That one's now only usable on battle tactic stratagems, not just stratagems in general, so it definitely has declined in value a bit, but on the other hand it's still going to be good to just throw at the enemy command point reroll, which could definitely be annoying. Will be pretty painful to make them have to pay 2 CP every time they reroll a charge, and there's still every chance that one of the better enemy stratagems might well be a battle tactic to give you a second option for that. Overall, even with the ability nerf, I would still see this as a pretty substantial upgrade. Dropping this much on an already good character is pretty immense, to be honest. He was very commonly being included in competitive lists. His ability definitely was a factor in his value, but otherwise he's just an enormously tanky character with 8 wounds and a 2+ save, and then 2 stacking durability rules of legendary tenacity to halve the damage coming in at him, and then a feel no pain 5+ save on top of that. It is a pretty big deal when you have those 2 things stacking. Say for example if he took a 6 damage shot, on average you'd only take 2 wounds from it. It did make him quite a nice choice for trying to activate sagas, particularly the Saga of the Bear, or maybe the one where you were trying to kill enemy vehicles or monsters, which you might be able to do at range with a las cannon. Overall, between all that, I'd absolutely definitely expect him to be cropping up in Space Wolves lists very consistently. He's got great combat with 6 attacks at strength 12 and damage 3, hitting on a 2+ with lethal hits, a big gun to pair it with, and he is faster than most Firstborn Dreadnoughts as well, moving 8 inches. There's a lot to like. One of the other units that were really quite key to the Space Wolves that dropped in points were the Thunderwolf Cavalry. They dropped down from 100 points down to 90, a big 10% decrease. I feel like this one is going to be quite a relevant one to them. They were perhaps one of the most commonly used unique units for mainline damage dealers, at least unlike units like the Wolf Guard with their relic weapons. They at least get 2 damage on the charge, which makes them a lot more threatening to quite a lot of targets. I feel that now that these guys are just 30 points, they're just pretty excellent value. 4 wounds at toughness 6 with a 3+ save and a 4+ invulnerable is just all around good. Neither anti-tank nor small arms is going to be particularly effective into that. They are fairly quick with a 10-inch move, though will need to move around terrain being mounted models. Advance and charge is possible in both Champions of Russ and the Gladius, though easier in the Gladius when it's just 1 CP. Then when they hit home, they do hit with a lot of Strength 5, AP 1 and Damage 1 attacks, not as many as the Wulfen, but still if you get the charge then you get Damage 2 on those attacks due to their Ferocious Charge special rule. This means they will generally be more efficient than units like Wulfen at killing things like 2-wound Space Marines, or to be honest really quite a lot of things with multi-wounds. I feel like if you were to give them any one character upgrade, then the Wolfguard Battle Leader on a Thunderwolf seems like a good choice, and he dropped a fair bit as well, all the way down to 80 points. I feel like lethal hits on 6s is exactly what this unit needs, as it's going to be fairly good at killing anything with low toughness, but will be struggling against anything it's wounding on a 6. A hidden Power Fist or Thunderhammer in the unit is definitely no bad idea either, I think. Overall, I definitely expect these guys to see some solid play going forward. They're just a great mix of fairly fast, fairly tough, and fairly dangerous. Next up, and for characters, I thought it might be worth mentioning the Primaris Space Wolf that is Ragnar Blackmane. 90 points down from 105, so a pretty significant points cut there. The profile of a fairly standard Space Marine Captain or Wolf Lord, but with a bunch more attacks. Ragnar gets a fairly monstrous 8 attacks at Strength 6, AP 3 and Damage 2 with Frostfang, with sustained hits on that as well, and when he makes a charge that goes all the way up to 10 attacks at Strength 8, Damage 2, a truly enormous threat that. With sustained hits that averages you killing around about 7 Space Marines in power armor just personally, never mind his squad, or around 6 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle, a fair bit better than quite a lot of unique characters will do. Then he doesn't get the free stratagems or anything that other captains would get, but he does get to advance and charge for the foot units that he leads. He can lead Wolfguard or Bloodclaws, though I feel like he could be quite an interesting one with Bladeguard. A fair few other unique characters are locked out of leading those, so it might be a reasonable one to embrace with quite a lot of similar attack profiles to himself. Overall, 90 points seems quite good for this amount of melee threat. I think he'd combine pretty nicely with a lieutenant or battle leader if desired. Getting lethal hits on all of those mid-strength attacks is absolutely brutal, never mind anything that the squad can get as well. Finally, for characters to focus on, I thought it would probably be worth mentioning the single biggest points cut in the entire index. Logan Grimnar went down from 145 to 100 points. I guess technically not the actual single biggest cut, seeing as that would be him on Storm Rider, but percentage-wise that is the biggest, a huge 32% drop, so almost a third of his value. Kind of nice to actually see the chapter master of the Space Wolves pulling his weight a bit more. I did think that 145 points was pretty heavily overcosted. It's definitely not useless in game, but this just feels far more in line with his abilities. He mainly does focus on the actual just sheer melee combat damage, as opposed to providing too many leadership abilities, which kind of feels a bit strange compared with some of the other chapter masters. For 100 points he gets you some pretty impressive melee stats, 6 attacks at Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 3 with the Axe Morkai, though you do get the option to trade it out for some sweeps if that makes more sense. A fairly chunky Terminator defensive profile, and his rule the High King of Fenris to give the Terminators a massive combat punch just once per game. You declare it in the charge phase, and you allow them to re-roll a charge to get them into combat, and if you do manage to make a successful charge and fight in the same turn, then you get to re-roll the hit roll in melee then. Both of those bits are pretty good to be honest, even just the charge reroll could be pretty handy to save you a command point if your Terminators fail the charge out of Deep Strike. But if you do manage to convert it and get them into combat, then that hit reroll is pretty monstrous. Between that and his own attacks, I feel like you're going to take out most of the things you contact like that. He also gets a 1 CP if he does personally slay a unit as well. It's not going to happen every game probably, but I feel like with his offensive profiles it's going to happen from time to time, definitely a nice to have. Overall seems to me like a lot more of a reasonable addition to a Terminator squad compared with the other things on offer, at least compared with where he was at that enormous 145 points, where I just didn't think he was very good at all. In any case, those 5 changes were probably my favourite 5 out of the update. There was a fair amount of other interesting stuff though. For some reason Wolf Scouts went up to 85 points, so a small increase there. Not really sure what the thinking of that was. I guess just run them with the normal Scouts datasheets until then, unless you absolutely need to have a power weapon in there or something. Skyclaws dropped a little down to 90 points, not too bad for fast moving Space Marines with a bonus on the charge, though their jump pack leader did go up a bit. Wolfguard Terminators went down to 195, so just a little bit more than the standard Terminator squad now. Not too much between them still, I think. The Wolfguard definitely have a fair few more options available to them. The Hounds of Morkai are down to 90 points. I still think they're significantly more interesting than Reavers given their devastating wound melee. And Grey Hunters went down to 85 points, perhaps mirroring some of the changes to things like Intercessors and Assault Intercessors in the wider Space Marine decks. Otherwise, for vehicle units, just dreadnoughts in general, whether they're standard Space Marine ones or Space Wolves, seem to have gone down quite a lot. The Wulfen dreadnought drops down to 130. I think that's perhaps a lot more interesting and close to where it needs to be. Definitely packs a punch with the Great Frost Axe, and the 4+ invulnerable save from the shield is nice. Objective Control 0 though is still pretty unhelpful, and even with that massive points cut I'm still not sure that it's one of the most interesting units in the index. The Space Wolf standard Venerable Dreadnought went down to 155. Murderfang saw a drop down to 170 points, obviously significantly more and still doesn't do any objectives, but I feel like perhaps a little bit more interesting just because of the sheer utter devastation that it unleashes. Big attacks with strength 14 and twin linked are just truly monstrous, plus it tank shocks very efficiently if you want it to. I still probably have Bjorn the Fell-Handed as my first choice though, particularly getting a bigger percentage drop than Murderfang does. Kind of a shame that they didn't really choose to do anything with the flyers here. It does seem to be a feature of the balance update that they didn't really try to do anything much with flyers of virtually any of the factions. Otherwise, Space Wolves are a very character heavy index. Pretty well every single unique character went down by various margins. A couple stayed the same, and the pack leader with the jump pack went up, though I still don't think it's too bad an idea for adding a power fist or something threatening into a unit of Skyclaws. I feel like most of these are quite interesting in their own way now. Obviously they're going to be competing against all the other very efficient options out there. I guess they've gained some ground relative to the generic Space Marine picks though, as most of the ones from the core codex stayed the same. Out of these, Ulrich the Slayer got a fairly impressive drop, down from 85 to 70. I feel like his combat buff is quite good, with the reroll 1s to hit and wound, plus more than that against any character, monster or vehicle units. Feels like fairly solid melee value for a unit of Bloodclaws or something. And all the Thunderwolf characters got some fairly respectable drops as well. I feel like that battle leader on Thunderwolf in particular looks stand out, 80 points for a fighty character and lethal hits, though the other two are fine as well. Logan on Storm Rider dropped all the way down from 235 to 180. I feel like you'd be a lot more tempted to field him at that cost, still probably not getting to one of the standout good units of the index though, I'd say. Overall though, I'd definitely say that this is a fair bunch of helpful changes for the Space Wolves. I think it's going to be a feels-good change for them to have a lot of incentive to use their actual unique units as opposed to just the generic units in Index Space Marines. Broadly speaking, I feel like more of these have dropped compared with the ones in the core Index. I still absolutely expect to see a lot of Thunderwolves and Bjorn on the table in quite a lot of Space Wolf lists. I think I'd genuinely be tempted to add a couple of small units of Wulfen in maybe, just for distractions and disruption. And otherwise really quite a lot of the characters seem pretty cool now. Probably something will be nice to lead some Thunderwolves, Ragnar Blackmane and Logan Grimnar. I feel like both gained some of the most out of most of these changes. Let me know what you make of them in any case. What adaptations, if any, would you be making to your Space Wolves list after the changes come out? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. Otherwise, a massive thank you for listening. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this, and of course a big thank you for Great Eyes Studios for sponsoring a Space Wolves video. Feel free to check the links down below if you're interested in any of the Space Wolf bits. In any case, an absolutely enormous thank you for listening. I'll hopefully be aiming to make a more complete review of the Space Wolf Index at some point in the future. Hopefully it shouldn't be too long now after the craziness of the Balance Dataslate updates settle down. A massive thanks for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.